watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi. Joining us from Singapore, it's good to have back on StratNews Global Professor C. Raja Mohan. He's the director of the Institute of South Asia Studies at the National University of Singapore, well-known foreign policy analyst and ex-editor in this region. Thanks again, Professor Raja Mohan, for your time.
Nice to have you.
And also from the capital, Professor Amitabh Mattoo. He's with CIPOD, that School of International Studies, JNU, and is also a professor at the International Relations at the University of Melbourne, an ex-member of the National Security Advisory Board as well. Professor Mattoo, good to see you after a while.
Great to see you, Amitabh, with this new avatar.
Professor Rajamohan, now the 2+2, the US 2+2 with India expected schedule at the end of this month. Just wanted to get initially your thoughts on the Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Biegun's statements when he was here. He was talking about the need for a rejuvenation of post-World War II Pacific Treaty alliances, saying that it's not necessarily needed for the US to follow the model of the last century of mutual defense treaties. What do you make of his comments on respecting what now has become very fashionable to talk about India's strategic economy? I beg your pardon, autonomy.
No, I think what has changed since 1945 is really the structure of the power distribution, as international theorists like Amitabh might give you a lot more on that. A structure that Euro-centered structure where Russia was the main contender for global influence, Europe was down, and you had a set of security alliances that came in. The rise of China has fundamentally altered that structure. So the US in the past had bilateral treaties with Japan, with Australia, with South Korea, and a whole range of countries. Those were designed to deal with the Soviet Union. So last 30 years, there was no rivalry between US and China and Soviet Union and Russia. So there was a period of tranquility, but now that is breaking down. So the rise of China and its assertion has called for a fresh thinking in terms of how you organize the security in this part of the world. So I think the attempt by Steve Biegun here or the last 2 years has really been the search for solutions to the consequences of the rise of China and the destabilization of the regional security order that has emerged.
Professor Mattoo, but at the same breath, you see Secretary Pompeo tweeting about the Quad. And I mean, on one hand, you're saying that you recognize India's traditions, strategic autonomy now. It's become definitely not an alignment. And Pompeo saying that, the American people need to be protected from the CCP. And one of the tools that we use is the Quad relationship. How do you see those two statements sitting with the Indo-U.S. relationship and how it's been evolving?
I don't see a great tension between the Deputy Secretary and the Secretary's remarks. I think these are responses to individual countries' sensitivities. The Deputy Secretary was speaking in India. The Secretary was speaking in Tokyo. However, the essence is clear that you're faced with a China which is not really accepting the rules of the international system. Some could argue that, like most other great powers in the past, it wants to rewrite the rules of the system, but there are no clarity on what those rules are, how free, open, accessible, inclusive those rules are going to be, and that you need an arrangement whereby countries who have interests and values and face a common threat can come together. Now that can take shape in different ways. A Quad is one arrangement which could become a foundation for a larger partnership in the region. Indians are extremely sensitive to the idea of a military alliance. And it's very easy to mobilize people against the idea of a military alliance. However, if you couch it in the idea of strategic autonomy plus, which is essentially you retain your independence, you retain your autonomy, however, you work with other like-minded countries, when you're faced and confronted with probably the greatest threat that you have faced since independence. So I completely, as I said, concur with Professor Rajamohan, more so because I'm reminded of a period in history when George F. Kennan, as the Charge d'Affaires in Moscow of the United States, wrote this long telegram, which was subsequently published in Foreign Affairs, but it was essentially a cable where he talked about how the new Soviet regime, which was a communist regime, was impervious to the logic of reason and could only understand the logic of power. So I think we are faced, obviously there are similarities and differences as well, but we are faced with a similar situation as obtained in 1945.
I think, Amitabh, you're overreading, Pompeo's statement. Look, he's explaining, justifying the Quad to the domestic audience in Washington.
Different audiences, like Professor Mattoo was talking
Quad is not a popular term in the US. I mean, it's only a small community in the foreign policy. Rest of the public wants to know what is Quad. I mean, why are we doing Quad? So I think he's trying to explain that there is a China threat, and therefore we are reaching out to the world's democracy. So there's no reference to alliance in that at all, and I don't see that a problem. Second, I think India too, has depended on the circumstance. It's not as if we're going with a flag and saying strategic autonomy always. When China attacked India in 1962, Nehru wrote to President Kennedy and said, "Send me some air force, because I have a problem on my frontiers." In 1971, we signed a treaty with the Soviet Union. Because of the crisis in Bangladesh, you needed Russian-Soviet support. So I think what India is doing itself, in the last 2 years, it's become more active in the Quad because there was Doklam in 2017. And just before that, China blocked us in the nuclear suppliers group. China is doing CPEC. China is supporting Pakistan far more deeply today than it is. And above all, now what's happened in Ladakh fundamentally threatens your security. That's what Mattoo was saying. So therefore, I think India is responding to that circumstance. We don't need the Americans to tell us, oh, we have a problem. And we're not just going by what the Americans say. We're negotiating with the Americans. What are the terms of this relationship? How this relationship will evolve? And there again, India has changed. If you go back to 1990s, we said multipolar world. We joined the Russians and the Chinese and say American unipolar dominance must be tempered by balanced. That's what the BRICS, the RIC were all about. But today we are in a unipolar Asia, which is threatening the territorial integrity of India. Therefore, you're looking for alternatives. You're looking for, no longer you can go to the BRICS and pray for the Chinese and say, please vacate my territory. He's saying, no, sorry, this is my territory. You vacate, he's saying. So therefore, you're finding ways to generate international support, generate a coalition that will take care of a security interest. So I think, in our discussions, moment you start from non-alignment strategic autonomy, you'll always go wrong. See, look, what are my interests at this point of time? What am I trying to achieve? If you start with the proposition, the rest is secondary, the process, the terms. Look, India is not a little baby in the wood. It can't negotiate. And the alliances themselves are very fragile today. Turkey is supposed to be part of NATO. It is fighting Greece.
True.
So I think we shouldn't be so obsessed with this alliance term that people make alliances that suit them and they leave them when they don't suit them. So I think we are in a fluid world. And I think Quad is one response to that situation.
A fluid world, Professor Mattoo, in terms of India's responses, would you also agree with, again, I'm going back to Steve Biegun when he mentioned Ambassador Ashok Kanta calling China the elephant in the room and saying that India has been too cautious in anything. Like even with the Quad, we've been worrying about the Malabar and including Australia because of the response from Beijing. Has India been too cautious in its response?
I mean, India has in some ways been the least cautious. Look at the Americans themselves. Look at the whole world. I mean, if you had the benefit of 2020 hindsight, would anyone have crafted this level of dependence on China? After the nuclear test, Clinton reached out to the Chinese leadership to try and put pressure on India. At one stage, there was this belief that China and the United States were the two. It was going to be a bipolar world, and they would manage the world together. And that China, I mean, there were streams of articles and policy papers which suggested that China was unlike any other great power. It was going to be different because it just believed in a certain Confucian view of the world. It never built empires. They were never forced you to eat with chopsticks, and culturally they were not going to extend their empire. And they had been socialized into the international system. That was the promise of liberal internationalism. Where is that promise today? Where is that promise that China would keep biding its time as Deng had hoped? No, it's nowhere. But then I agree with Rajat is that you are playing chess and you need to, even if you're beginning as a rookie, but you have to now imagine a board in which you are making several moves together to try and see what will you get, what is the best way to position yourself. So alliance is not a fait accompli. It's something that you negotiate, you work towards organically. So you have to see what will the Americans bring to the table. Why did Nehru? Finally not have much of a traction with the Americans? Because it really did not offer very much. Because particularly after Nehru and India's opposition to the Vietnam War, but we have to see what Americans bring on the table. We have to see what Japan, Australia bring to the table. For instance, I have talked about, and this is of course a pipe dream, but why should India be included in the most core intelligence network, the Five Eyes? Japan is trying to negotiate something along those lines, but real-time operational intelligence, action intelligence. If we are going along that path where you can see clear benefits, then the memory of the past, the history of the past, and the ideology of the past should not become a burden on the present and the advancement of Indian national interest today. So I think it's a way of beg your pardon?
In terms of national interest, Professor Radhamohan, the Quad itself and the Quad Plus in a different dimension has been talked about. Where do you see the direction of that moving, Professor Radhamohan?
No, I think on the Quad itself, I mean, I would say more has happened bilaterally between India and the US. Yeah. In the last, what started out very hesitantly, very tentatively, we've seen the pressure from China, in the last 10 years, the more expansive India-US defense cooperation has become. Second, I think the India-Japan relationship has advanced, India-Australia relationship has advanced. So I think if you just focus only on the Quad, you miss the larger thing that has happened bilaterally, already moved quite significantly with all of them. So how far do you go in Quad? I mean, India is still saying, look, it is a coordinating mechanism, while the Americans are now talking about institutionalization. So that debate will go on. But I think India was also right to be, do it deliberately, because after all, we have a long border with China. How we do this with deliberate caution, but we've advanced. So there is no question of India not advancing. It has advanced from where it is, and so has the challenges have mounted. So that is one part. Second, I think as we look ahead, the issue is how do we strengthen these ties bilaterally, and I think that's why the 2+2 is really about bilateral cooperation between India and the US. And if you look at the last meeting, I think we made significant progress. So that will continue. So I think, I would say we must keep advancing bilaterally, and also Quad is not the only mechanism. There is a talk about Australia, France, because France is an important player in the Indian Ocean, in the Western Indian Ocean, as well as in the Pacific, the bits of it. Can we do more things with Indonesia, for example? Can we do more things with Vietnam? So it's not just Quad or nothing else. So I think Quad is one. We're doing other things. Finally, I want to say something about alliances. Pakistan signed an alliance agreement, anti-communist alliance agreement, CIPOD, CENTO. They were supposed to be alliances, right? And in Asia, there was only one communist giant, that was China. In 16 years, within a few years, they were making a deal with the Chinese. So did the American alliance stop them from befriending China, against whom they're supposed to have signed a treaty? In fact, then they became the bridge between US and China by 71. So I think, we shouldn't get too, So an alliance is not a marriage or made in heaven. It can't be separated forever. Countries come together to deal with common interests. Countries will fall apart when they can't get together. As I said, the BRICS example, just 20 years ago we were doing BRICS, still doing it, but now you face a threat from China. And I think the question is, how do you deal with the Chinese threat, which is what the principal challenge for India, not just in terms of the border, the scale of the economic challenge that you face today, your trade deficit. So now what we've seen happen, the Quad Plus, if Quad was more about security, Quad Plus has been more about economics. And I think after the pandemic, we are seeing, can there be rearrangement of the globalization, which has so far been China-centered? Can there be an alternative to that? Japan is giving money to its industry to move out of China to Southeast Asia. US is encouraging. But it's going to be a long process. It's not as if you can switch on and move all factories out of China and they're going to come to India. Sure. India is trying to attract Apple and a whole lot of other manufacturers from China. So I think as Chinese have put economic pressure, there is an attempt to widen Quad in relation to Quad Plus. That includes Vietnam, New Zealand, and South Korea, and occasionally Brazil and Israel. So I think there are attempts at creating a new set of coalitions that will provide some relief from the consequences of a US-China partnered globalization. Once China joined the capitalist world, then that became the center for economic globalization. And today, the political rift between them has opened space for rearranging the global economic value chains. And that's where India is debating. How far India will succeed remains to be seen.
Sure. Those realignments, whatever words you want to use, Professor Mattoo, and again, as Professor Rajamohan was pointing out, bilaterally, you mentioned Australia, Japan. France was brought up by Professor Rajamohan. They've also appointed a senior diplomat now for the Indo-Pacific. Germany's come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy of its own. UK is trying to move it. So it is multi-dimensional, right?
Oh, absolutely. And in terms of evolution, if we're talking about India, India's gradual incremental shift, given its perception of China, look at a country like Australia, which is my second home. I've been there for 10 years now. 10 years ago, you couldn't say a word against China. If you talked about as much as calling up His Holiness the Dalai Lama for a video conference, people would shudder and say that they're going to lose revenues. It's a transactional country. It's always been in that way in many ways. So they viewed China as a source of their economic prosperity because China's hunger for raw materials, natural resources, really helped the Australian economy boom. Chinese students were the largest number of students in Australia. Chinese immigrants, skilled immigrants, the largest number of immigrants in Australia. So, to the point that Australia had invested no other eggs, not even one egg in the Indian basket, for instance. To the point that the Chinese started interfering in Chinese elections. There were more Confucius institutes spread all over universities in China. Sam Dastyari, a liberal MP, confessed that the Chinese Communist Party was paying him. I mean, this is this level of degree of dependence. And if you talk to the court, and if you had an audience with Kevin Rudd, which I had on one occasion, I mean, you would have thought that you had just abused him because he was so anti-court. And today, Marisa Payne and Jaishankar have the closest friendship and relationship, driven by personal chemistry, but also driven by the fact that the Australians are recognizing now what mistakes they may have made in the past. So, in some ways, to carry the metaphor in a much more colorful millennial language, I would say the Quad or arrangements like that, as Rajamohan said, is not a marriage forever. It's somewhere between a one-night stand and a marriage. The one-night stand might progress to an affair and finally a marriage, but it's that transition that you have to see. You are arriving at arrangements which might be unique. So do not think of arrangements as ossified in history, as something which you have to look at the Cold War or look at 19th century Europe for answers. We have to find our own answers. We have to find our own arrangements. And however, I think Quad, the interesting thing about Quad is that it brings Australia, Japan, and India together. It's focused and it has the backing of the United States. More importantly, I think we should not overdo the alphabet soup, as Rajamohan often used to refer different kinds of arrangements, because that distracts.
Yeah.
The fact that you are driven by the Quad, at least for the moment, is something that is able to mobilize the intellect, the thoughts. You have think tankers from across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, writing about it. But if we suddenly say, okay, we may include it, we may expand it, but let's focus on it. So the only minor difference, if I do, with Dr. Rajamohan, is that while there are other arrangements, and India should keep exploring that, until this initiative collapses for some reason which I cannot immediately or intuitively see, let's just remain focused on the Quad for the moment. It's also, I mean, given the reaction of economists of China, it's obviously troubling them now to an extent that they're talking about a new NATO in the Asia Pacific.
Yeah.
They should also introspect and realize that if there's a new NATO in the Asia Pacific, is it merely a creation of the United States, or are the Chinese and the manner in which the Chinese are protecting their power also responsible? These are difficult times, and requires not difficult times do not always have simple answers, but you need to have clarity of thinking.
Professor Rajamohan, like you had pointed out in your earlier answer, no simple answers to what's being called economic decoupling, whether it's India itself or the various other countries who have such deep roots with China in terms of economics. How do you see India progressing along that path?
No, we've seen in response to the Ladakh aggression, I mean, one of the Indian escalation was on the economic side, while it has deployed troops to match the Chinese mobilization. It is trying to raise costs on China through economic steps by scrutinizing Chinese foreign investment in India, by introducing new tariffs on Chinese imports, by banning the digital apps. So I think India is trying to raise the costs of Chinese action through economic steps. Simultaneously, India is also trying to now, post-pandemic, working with other countries on developing resilient supply chains. India is wooing, as I said, companies based in China like Apple, Foxconn, some of those producers to come to India. So I think so this process, again, will, I think, whether Quad goes very far or not, the logic of rearranging economic interdependence with China has, of course, preceded the Ladakh crisis. That the trade deficit was a big issue, that India's largest quantum of trade deficit is with China, and has had difficulty persuading China to address it seriously. So my sense is, whether Americans go back to China or not, India needs to find a way to reduce the imbalance of the economic relationship with China, and I think that's where the challenge is going to endure. And therefore, if we succeed in the current effort, that will make it easier for India to for its own rise, as well as to reduce the one-sided dependence on China that has emerged.
Professor Mattoo, you have been talking about bilateral and even trilateral. It's Australia, Japan, and India who are looking at supply chain resilience, isn't it? But is that more than just diplomatic speak at various fora like this, or is something actually emerging on the ground?
I think at the moment it's begun as an intention. It's not easy because there are huge transaction costs in terms of decoupling, and capitalism is driven by profit rather than by ideology. So if they see it being much cheaper to keep manufacturing in China, they will. So you have to make it attractive, competitive, at least offer a climate of investment. Apple, for instance, when you start producing the iPhone 12, I think out of its Hyderabad factory, or
somewhere in south or Chennai, maybe, or Bangalore.
Then it's also driven this Atmanirbhar Bharat, this Made in India thing. I think it's given that kind of impetus to India. Indian manufacturing. Now you have masks they made in India. Otherwise, about the beginning of the pandemic, you couldn't find a mask which was not made in China. You still, anecdotally speaking, in terms of the um, lighting and fittings, uh, there are very few. If you go to Bhagirath's place in Delhi, which is the largest wholesale market for electrical goods, you still find it difficult to get made in India. It's all China Italian copied in China. So those things are obvious that for dealers and manufacturers, we have not become competitive enough. But I think it's a process. And it's a process. And obviously, I think if these countries intervene in a fashion and reciprocate, for instance, Australia is doing, through tariff and non-tariff barriers, the cost of Chinese imports, then quite clearly, beyond the market, you will make it more competitive for other consumers. For the larger strategic decoupling, there needs to be a much greater coordination. There's a World Bank study in terms of how that can how that is happening. But at the moment, China is the largest manufacturer of consumer durable goods. We have to recognize that. Recognizing that, we need to see this as a long, sustained strategy which we have to follow consistently over a long period of time, 3 to 5 years before you can see a real strategic decoupling. It's not going to be less than 3 to 5 years. I'm not a model. I don't do economic modeling, but that's what my people who do modeling tell me: 3 to 5 years. If there was a conscious, clear, systematic effort. And let me say this, because there's some concern about Pompeo, and Pompeo having said this, and the Deputy Secretary having come here, that this is they're on the cusp of an election year, and Biden and Harris may have a different agenda. I don't think that's true. I think Biden and Harris on China are exactly the same.
A perfect point to that's a perfect point to ask President Rajamohan. We're talking about 3 to 5 years for a sustained strategy to actually work. What happens in 2 to 3 weeks, either or, in the U.S. elections? Does that change anything around the world?
No, I think everybody in the world, including, from where I am in Singapore, in Delhi, Tokyo, everyone is watching how this will play out. My sense is that there would be some contestation for the policy direction under a Biden administration. So on the security establishment, I think, has quite clearly moved significantly in the last few years. I mean, even starting under Obama administration, the challenges that they face from China, they want to deal with. Within the Congress, in fact, the Democrats have been far more critical of China's human rights practices. The resolutions have been passed on Tibet, on Xinjiang, and a whole lot of issues. So there is actually, Democratic Party has become far more critical of China, and there is strong support for that in the Congress. On the economic side, I mean, there are divisions. There's some sections which want more accelerated decoupling, but there could be others who are saying, no, let's try and salvage this relationship in some form or the other. So that's for a contestation. But I agree with Professor Mattoo that you can't go back to the good old days between US and China. The Chinese, I think, are making a big effort to tell the incoming administration, look, we can be your partners in climate change. Let's rework this economic relationship. So the Chinese would try and prevent a significant evolution, or try and push it back to the old lines. So, but how that plays out in the U.S. internal, structures within the Democratic Party, in the new administration, of course, remains to be seen. But I think there is a broader direction that has been set, which is more, should we say, conflictual. Within that, they could be temporizing that how Biden says he would consult the allies a lot more than Trump has. For example, on trade issues, in writing with everyone, he would try to get the allies together. And there are points of similarity, actually. Both Trump has talked about a G10 summit after the elections. Then the Democrats, Biden has talked about a democracy summit. There are groups of people on both sides who are talking about on 5G and technology issues, they must be democratic countries, must come together. So I think whichever way happens, I think India is going to be part of the solution. And the question is, are we ready intellectually to deal with that is the issue.
Last words to you, Professor Mattoo. I mean, has China gone too far down the road for anything to change, even if the incumbent in the White House changes?
Frankly, I think China at the moment doesn't seem to care. This wolf warrior attitude, this I don't give a damn for my reputation of what the world thinks of me, is dangerous. It's dangerous because it suggests that it's impervious to public opinion. Now, I think in these circumstances, uh, and the fact that they're not risk averse, they're willing to take risky decisions under Xi Jinping. And we mark this 1 year of the last summit between Modi and Xi today. Um, uh, and that he's willing to throw the rules into the Pacific when it comes to what he perceives to be Chinese interests, suggests that Joe Biden, and I take the nuance about a disaggregated view of the Democratic Party, but perhaps more aggressive on human rights, and perhaps more soft on issues like trade and climate change, and maybe more couched in a uh, uh, less aggressive posture than Pompeo or Trump. But I think in a macro telescopic view, the policy is not going to change. The concerns about China in the United States, the mainstream of the United States, within Congress and think tanks suggest that unless China, as I said, unless China changes its behavior, and there's no evidence to suggest that it will, this confrontation will go on. In any case, I think it's wise, prudent, not worst case, wise and prudent thinking to believe that China is going to continue along this path for the foreseeable future. And therefore, we need to have insurance policies, maybe multiple insurance policies, to guard against this huge threat. And it's a threat which is much bigger than even most China skeptics imagine it to be.
Professor Amitabh Mattoo, absolute pleasure having you on StratNews, and we hope to see you much more often. Thanks again, Professor Mattoo.
Thank you so much, Amitabh, and thank you, Professor Rajamohan.
Thank you.
And Professor Rajamohan, of course, yeah, great having you on. Thanks for your time.
Nice to be with you.
Yeah. Thank you.
And if you do support our journalism, you can go onto our website. You've been watching Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.